There's something genuinely eerie about a place built entirely for joy, just sitting empty. Roller coasters frozen mid-track, ticket booths collecting dust, parking lots swallowed by weeds. Most of us have no idea how many of these places have just vanished. So today, we're counting down 10 forgotten theme parks in America you didn't know closed. Number 10, Geauga Lake, Aurora, Ohio. If you grew up in Northeast Ohio, Geauga Lake was a rite of passage. Founded in 1888 as a simple picnic and boating destination on the shores of Geauga Lake in Aurora, it spent over a century quietly growing into one of the most beloved regional amusement parks in the Midwest. For generations of Ohio families, it wasn't a special occasion, it was just what you did in the summer. By the 1990s, Geauga Lake had developed a solid reputation with a dependable lineup of coasters, water rides, and seasonal events. In 2000, Six Flags acquired the park and went big, purchasing the neighboring SeaWorld Ohio property and merging the two into a sprawling complex that included marine animal shows alongside the thrill rides. On paper, it was a compelling destination. In practice, it stretched operations thin across a lot of real estate. Six Flags was in financial trouble across its entire portfolio by the mid-2000s, and Geauga Lake was one of the parks that paid the price. In 2004, Cedar Fair, the company that operates Cedar Point, just 80 miles to the west, stepped in and purchased the property. Rather than building Geauga Lake into a genuine competitor, Cedar Fair began methodically scaling back its attractions. Rides disappeared one season at a time, and the crowds that had once filled the park began drifting north toward Cedar Point instead. Cedar Fair closed Geauga Lake's ride section permanently in September 2007. The official reasoning was poor attendance and unsustainable operating costs. The water park component held on until 2016 before shutting down as well. The coasters were sold off or demolished. The site was subsequently redeveloped into a mixed-use residential and retail development. Today, if you stood on that ground without knowing its history, you'd have no idea. As one former employee described it, it felt like watching something die slowly. One season the place was packed, and then suddenly half the rides were just gone. What's particularly striking about Geauga Lake isn't just that it closed. It's how methodically it was unwound. The park didn't burn down or flood. It was simply drained, one asset at a time, by the company that bought it. At its height, Geauga Lake had attractions that genuinely competed with anything in the region. The Big Dipper wooden coaster dated back to 1925, and the Double Loop was one of the country's earliest looping steel coasters when it debuted in 1977. These weren't just rides. They were landmarks that had defined summer for multiple generations of Northeast Ohio residents. When Cedar Fair sold them off to other parks, it wasn't just a business transaction. It was the dispersal of a shared regional identity. The community response to the closure was significant. Residents organized and pushed back. But once the economics were decided, the outcome was never really in doubt. A park that had outlasted 2 world wars and multiple corporate owners couldn't survive being purchased by the competition. Number 9, Opryland USA, Nashville, Tennessee. Opryland USA deserves to be remembered a lot more than it is. Opened in 1972 by the organization behind the Grand Ole Opry, Opryland USA was a theme park built around a specific identity, American music, and Southern culture. It wasn't trying to be Disney World, and it made no apologies for that. The park featured live musical performances across multiple stages, everything from country and bluegrass to gospel and contemporary pop, alongside traditional rides and seasonal attractions. The combination worked. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Opryland was drawing millions of visitors annually, and had become genuinely central to Nashville's tourism identity. It was also the anchor of a broader entertainment campus that included the Opryland Hotel, one of the largest non-casino hotels in the world, the General Jackson Showboat on the Cumberland River, and TNN, the Nashville Network, which broadcast from the property. For a while, Opryland wasn't just a theme park, it was a media and hospitality empire with a theme park attached. But by the mid-1990s, things had shifted. Attendance was declining, and Gaylord Entertainment, which had taken over park operations, began evaluating the property strictly from a real estate standpoint. The riverside location along the Cumberland was valuable, and a proposal emerged to convert the park into something with more consistent year-round revenue, a shopping mall. Opryland USA closed after the 1997 season. The demolition was swift, and in 2000, Opry Mills, a large outlet and entertainment mall, opened on the site. The reaction from Nashville residents and longtime visitors was, to put it gently, not enthusiastic. What got lost in the transition was the park's genuine cultural texture. The live performances, the sense that the park reflected something real about American music history, the kind of institutional memory that builds up under 25 years of operation, none of that transferred to a mall. You can find outlet stores in nearly any city in America. You couldn't find another Opryland. The park had also been a launch pad. Performers who appeared on Opryland stages in the 1970s and 1980s went on to significant careers in country music. The park ran its own talent development programs and functioned, in a practical sense, as a pipeline between aspiring musicians and Nashville's broader industry. When it closed, that pipeline closed with it. There's a certain irony in the fact that the Opryland Hotel, which sits right where the park once bordered it, is still one of the most visited destinations in Nashville. Millions of people walk through the hotel's indoor gardens and convention spaces every year, often without realizing they're standing at the edge of what was once an active theme park. The hotel survived. The park that made the hotel relevant in the first place didn't. Number 8, Freedomland USA, the Bronx, New York. Before Six Flags, before Great Adventure, before most of the theme park infrastructure that defines the Northeast today, there was Freedomland USA, and it is almost entirely forgotten. Freedomland opened in 1960 in the Northeast Bronx, constructed on a landfill site near the Hutchinson River. The concept was sweeping in its ambition. The park was designed in the shape of the continental United States, with themed zones representing different regions and periods of American history. The Old Southwest section featured stagecoach robberies. The Little Old New York section recreated turn-of-the-century Manhattan. Satellite City looked forward to a futuristic America of space-age technology. The whole thing covered 85 acres and was promoted at the time of its opening as the largest outdoor entertainment complex in the world. That's not a small claim, and the early numbers seem to validate it. Hundreds of thousands of visitors came in the first seasons. The New York press gave it enthusiastic coverage, and for a brief moment, it genuinely seemed like the Bronx had its own answer to Disneyland. The financial reality was brutal from almost the beginning. Construction had gone severely over budget. The landfill site created persistent engineering problems. The ground shifted, infrastructure cracked, and maintenance costs were relentless. Management turnover was constant. The park went through multiple ownership configurations in just 4 years, none of which stabilized the finances. Freedomland closed in 1964, just 4 years after opening. The site was cleared, and the land became the foundation for Co-op City, a massive residential development in the Northeast Bronx that still stands today as one of the largest cooperative housing complexes in the world. If you've traveled I-95 through the Bronx, you've passed within a quarter-mile of the site without any indication of what once stood there. For a park that was marketed as a direct competitor to Disneyland and drew serious national attention at its launch, the totality of its erasure from public consciousness is almost startling. Part of what makes Freedomland such a compelling story is the gap between ambition and execution. The designers brought in Charles Luckman, a prominent architect, and the park's layout, visible from the air in the literal shape of the United States, was a genuinely original concept. Walking through themed chapters of American history wasn't borrowed from anywhere, it was its own thing. But ambition and construction budgets rarely coexist comfortably in the amusement park business. Admission prices were considered steep for the era, which dampened repeat visits. Getting to the Northeast Bronx was inconvenient enough to discourage spontaneous trips. And in the summer of 1963, a series of disturbances at the park drew negative press coverage that further hurt attendance in its final year. By the time it closed in 1964, Freedomland had cycled through multiple management structures and accumulated debts that made revival impossible. Disneyland, which opened 5 years earlier on a similar scale of ambition, is still operating. The difference between the two isn't concept, it's execution, location, and the specific genius of the people behind one of them. Number 7. World of Sid and Marty Krofft, Atlanta, Georgia. Here's a piece of theme park history so strange it almost sounds fabricated. In 1976, Sid and Marty Krofft, the television producers responsible for H.R. Pufnstuf, Land of the Lost, The Bugaloos, and roughly a dozen other shows that defined Saturday morning television throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, opened an indoor theme park, not in a converted warehouse, not in a repurposed fairground, inside a 6-story shopping complex called the Omni International in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. The World of Sid and Marty Krofft occupied multiple levels of the Omni, covering a substantial footprint with character zones pulled directly from their television productions, a carousel, a puppet theater, and immersive environments designed to feel like walking into one of their shows. Admission was $2.75 for adults. The Krofft brothers invested heavily in production quality, bringing the same visual sensibility from their TV work into a three-dimensional space. It opened in May 1976. It closed in October 1976. 5 months. That's the entire operational life of the World of Sid and Marty Krofft. Attendance never approached what was needed to sustain operations. The concept of an indoor theme park embedded inside a shopping complex in a mid-size American city in the mid-1970s was simply not something the market was prepared to support at that scale. The Krofft brothers absorbed millions of dollars in losses. The Omni International complex was later redeveloped and eventually became CNN Center, where CNN has been headquartered since 1987. The building that once housed a psychedelic children's theme park now houses one of the world's most prominent news organizations. You genuinely could not make that up. Sid Krofft later reflected that the park was ahead of its time. Maybe a 6-story indoor theme park built around puppets and Saturday morning characters was always going to be a difficult proposition. Either way, 5 months is a breathtaking run for something that ambitious. What's easy to overlook is how genuinely mainstream the Krofft brand was in 1976. H.R. Pufnstuf premiered in 1969 and ran continuously into the early 1970s. The audience existed. The brand recognition existed. The park just couldn't convert any of that into sustainable daily attendance at a downtown Atlanta location requiring a deliberate trip. Brand recognition and theme park economics are two very different things, and the Kroffts found out the hard way. Number 6. Pontchartrain Beach Amusement Park. New Orleans, Louisiana. If you're from New Orleans, you already feel something when you hear this name. If you're not, you're about to understand why. Pontchartrain Beach opened in 1928 on the southern shore of Lake Pontchartrain. For 55 years, it functioned as New Orleans' primary amusement destination. Roller coasters, rides, a beach, and an atmosphere unmistakably tied to the culture of the city it served. Hot summers, the smell of fried food drifting through the midway, families making the same trip their parents had made before them. It had the kind of deep community roots that only come from decades of sustained use. The park's history is complicated by its racial legacy. For much of its operation, Pontchartrain Beach was racially segregated. Black residents of New Orleans were directed to Lincoln Beach, a separate facility also on Lake Pontchartrain that operated from 1939 to 1964. That history is an essential part of the full story of the park, and it's worth naming directly. The main park desegregated in 1965 following the Civil Rights Act, but decades of exclusion are a significant part of what Pontchartrain Beach was. By the late 1970s, attendance had been declining steadily. The infrastructure was aging. Competing entertainment options were growing. The cost of maintaining an aging lakefront park was climbing. Pontchartrain Beach closed permanently in 1983. The deterioration that followed was slow and visible. The site sat largely unused. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 battered what remained of the old structures. Over the following years, the ruined midway and overgrown lots became a destination for urban photographers documenting abandonment. Some of the site was eventually incorporated into Lakeshore Park, a public green space. The footprint of the old Zephyr roller coaster became a fishing pier. It's a strange kind of memorial. The bones of a park repurposed into something practical, without any particular marker acknowledging what it once was. What Pontchartrain Beach had, in its better decades, was a lineup of rides that punched well above the weight of a regional park. The Zephyr roller coaster, which opened in 1948, was a steel and wood hybrid designed by none other than the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, one of the most respected names in coaster manufacturing at the time. The Reagan Cajun, added in later years, was another crowd favorite. These weren't afterthoughts. The park made real investments in its ride lineup, and the lakefront setting gave it a natural ambiance that no amount of manufactured theming could replicate. The New Orleans identity was baked into everything at Pontchartrain Beach. The food, the music that drifted through the midway, the way the park felt like an extension of the city rather than a retreat from it. That's rare. Most amusement parks are deliberately separate from their surroundings, contained environments designed to feel like nowhere in particular. Pontchartrain Beach felt like New Orleans. That specificity was both its greatest strength and something that made it essentially impossible to preserve once the physical park was gone. Number 5. Pleasure Island, Wakefield, Massachusetts. Opened in 1959 in Wakefield, Massachusetts, Pleasure Island was a mid-century New England regional park that operated for a decade before closing in 1969. At 34 acres, it wasn't large by national standards, but it drew consistent audiences with a combination of rides, live entertainment, and a small zoo component that worked well for families with younger children. What makes Pleasure Island historically interesting isn't entirely what happened inside the park. It's a name connected to its development: Harrison Buzz Price. Price was the economic consultant who conducted the feasibility research that led to Anaheim being selected as the site for Disneyland, and later did the same work that pointed Walt Disney's team toward the Orlando area for Walt Disney World. His influence on the geographic shape of modern American theme parks is profound and almost entirely unknown outside the industry. Price's firm had a hand in the planning for Pleasure Island. a modest regional park in Massachusetts tied, however loosely, to the man who had done more than anyone else to determine where American theme parks were built. The park featured carousel rides, a Ferris wheel, dark rides, a roller coaster, and themed areas drawing on colonial New England history. It fit its regional setting and audience well. After closure in 1969, the animals were rehomed and the site was redeveloped. Pleasure Island belongs to the first generation of Disneyland-inspired regional parks. Operators across the country had watched Disneyland succeed in 1955 and immediately began imagining smaller local versions. Most of those parks are gone. Pleasure Island was among the earlier ones to close. What made Pleasure Island somewhat distinctive within that wave of parks was its attention to setting. Rather than assembling rides on a flat lot, the park used its 34 acres to create walking environments with some narrative coherence, colonial New England architecture, wooded pathways, and a layout that tried to feel like a destination rather than a fairground. For 1959, that level of deliberate regional theming was ahead of most comparable operations. The decade between its 1959 opening and 1969 closure captures a specific transitional moment in American leisure. The early Disneyland-inspired parks had launched with genuine optimism, and by the late 1960s, many were already struggling against a landscape that was getting more competitive. Six Flags was expanding. Busch Gardens was growing. Smaller operations without the capital to keep pace were quietly beginning to fall away, and Pleasure Island was among the first to go. Number 4, Joyland Amusement Park, Wichita, Kansas. Joyland opened in 1949 and served south-central Kansas for 55 years. For a region without a major metropolitan area nearby and limited large-scale entertainment infrastructure by coastal standards, Joyland occupied a specific and important place in the local calendar. It was the park, the place families in Wichita and the surrounding area simply went every summer. The park's centerpiece was its wooden roller coaster. Built in 1949 and operational for the park's entire life. There was also a carousel, a Spillman engineering model from the same year, a dark ride called the Pretzel, a whip, and a well-maintained midway. Joyland never tried to compete with larger regional parks. It was exactly what it was, and it stayed that way for 5 decades. The park closed in 2004. Without ongoing maintenance or security, the property deteriorated steadily. Vandalism accelerated the damage. The roller coaster structure began to decay. The site became a documented destination for urban explorers. The crumbling buildings and overgrown midway had a certain visual quality that photography communities gravitated toward, though it's a grim substitute for the place actually operating. The carousel fared considerably better. It was carefully removed, restored, and now operates at Botanica, Wichita's botanical gardens. It's the most tangible surviving piece of what Joyland was. The coaster was less fortunate. By the 2020s, most of the original structures had been demolished or had collapsed. There were periodic discussions about revival, none of which materialized. A park that served Wichita families for 55 years left behind almost nothing physical, except a carousel turning in a garden across town, if you know where to look. Number 3, the Cannonball at Lake Winnipesaukee, Rossville, Georgia. A clarification first. Lake Winnipesaukee, Lake Winnie to generations of visitors, is not closed. It opened in 1925 and is still operating today, which makes it one of the oldest continuously running amusement parks in the United States. That longevity is worth acknowledging. But the Cannonball is gone. And for most people who grew up making the trip to Rossville, the Cannonball was the point. Built in 1967, the Cannonball was a classic wooden, out-and-back roller coaster. No inversions, no launch systems, no technology more complicated than a chain lift and the laws of physics. It ran for 56 years. Families from the Chattanooga area and across the Tennessee Valley rode it for generations, and the pattern was consistent. You rode it with your parents, then you brought your own kids, then you brought your grandkids. That kind of layered generational familiarity with a single ride is genuinely rare. Lake Winnie retired the Cannonball in 2023, citing the escalating cost of maintaining aging wooden coaster infrastructure. It was a decision that made financial sense and broke a meaningful number of hearts simultaneously. I rode that coaster with my grandmother, then with my kids, and then with my grandkids, one longtime visitor told a local news outlet. 3 generations on the same ride? There's nothing to replace that. The park installed a new coaster. It continues to operate, but the Cannonball was 56 years old, and 56 years of shared rides don't transfer to something new. That's not a criticism of what replaced it. It's just an honest accounting of what was lost. Sometimes the loss isn't a park closing. Sometimes it's one ride retiring and taking a disproportionate amount of meaning with it. Number 2, Circus World, Haines City, Florida. While Disney World was transforming Central Florida after 1971, a different kind of attraction was quietly trying to find its footing about 60 miles to the southwest in Haines City. Circus World opened in 1974, built on a property that had served for decades as the winter headquarters for Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. The concept leaned directly into that history. Live circus acts, animal performances, exhibits about American circus heritage, and rides woven into an environment designed to celebrate the traveling circus tradition. For a new Florida park trying to carve out an identity distinct from Disney World, it was a reasonable strategy. The connection to Ringling Brothers gave it genuine historical grounding rather than manufactured theming. In its early years, Circus World drew respectable numbers for a regional park, operating in the shadow of one of the most visited tourist destinations on the planet. The circus performances were a genuine differentiator, and the park found its audience. The 1980s made things harder. Busch Gardens in Tampa was expanding its coaster lineup. Epcot opened in 1982, deepening the Disney ecosystem. SeaWorld in Orlando was growing. The Florida theme park market was becoming increasingly competitive at the upper end, and Circus World was getting squeezed. In 1987, the park rebranded as Boardwalk and Baseball, replacing the circus identity with a carnival boardwalk theme and adding a Major League Baseball spring training component in partnership with the Cincinnati Reds. The rebranding generated some initial attention, but didn't reverse the underlying attendance trends. Boardwalk and Baseball closed in January 1990 after just 3 seasons under the new name. The site was sold and redeveloped. The circus legacy that had given the original park its identity is now largely a footnote in regional history. What's worth noting is how significant the Ringling Brothers connection actually was. The company had been wintering in the Haines City area since the early 20th century. Rehearsal rings, animal quarters, the off-season infrastructure of a working traveling circus. That history was physically embedded in the land. Opening a theme park on top of it wasn't manufactured theming. It was an attempt to build on actual heritage. That's a rare and genuinely valuable starting point, and it wasn't enough. The Boardwalk and Baseball rebrand in 1987 is particularly telling, trading a circus identity, distinctive by definition, for a generic boardwalk and baseball concept, removed the one thing that set the park apart from anything else in Florida. By 1987, smaller parks simply couldn't break into the upper tier of the Florida market from below. The major operators had the marketing budgets, the hotel partnerships, and the brand gravity to capture family vacation decisions before a regional park ever got a chance to make its case. Boardwalk and baseball closed in January 1990, midwinter without completing a full season, and the property was sold and redeveloped. A quiet ending for a place with a genuinely interesting origin. Number 1, Pacific Ocean Park, Santa Monica/Ocean Park, California. We're closing with one of the most fascinating and least remembered chapters in American theme park history. Pacific Ocean Park opened in 1958 on a pier along the Southern California coast, in the Ocean Park neighborhood at what is now the border of Santa Monica and Venice. Known as POP, it was designed as a futuristic marine-themed destination that drew on the era's genuine fascination with oceanography and space exploration. The park featured an underwater theme zone, simulated ocean voyage attractions, rides embedded into the pier structure, and a visual aesthetic that was unmistakably late 1950s American. Curved edges, chrome finishes, and a fundamental optimism about what the future held. Attendance in the first year reportedly exceeded 1 million visitors. That's a substantial number for a pier-based attraction in 1958. POP generated real excitement, the kind of cultural buzz that comes from something genuinely new arriving in a familiar landscape. Management problems surfaced quickly. The pier's structural condition required constant and expensive maintenance. Ownership changed, financial backing grew unstable, and the facilities that had looked forward-looking in 1958 began looking dated by the mid-1960s. The actual space age had arrived. The first American spacewalk, the moon shots, the real thing, and a carnival simulation of ocean exploration had a harder time holding the public's imagination against that backdrop. Pacific Ocean Park closed in 1967, 9 years after opening. The pier sat derelict for several years afterward, becoming known in surfing communities as a lawless hangout beneath the abandoned structure. A fire damaged what remained in 1974, and demolition was completed by the mid-1970s. The pilings were pulled, the structure was removed, and the site returned to open ocean. There is no physical trace, no marker, no remaining structure, no piece of infrastructure you can visit. The site of a park that once drew over 1 million visitors in a single season is now just water off the Southern California coast. It was like the future had come to the beach, one former visitor recalled, and then the tide just took it away. That's about as accurate a description as anything. 10 parks. Some ran for generations. Some barely made it past opening week. Some were demolished deliberately. Some crumbled on their own. And some simply disappeared into the landscape without a trace. What they share is straightforward. People loved them. Families built annual traditions around them. Kids had their first roller coaster experiences on them. And then, through bad finances, corporate decisions, floods, fires, or just time, they were gone. Most of them are forgotten. That doesn't mean they didn't matter. It just means they needed someone to talk about them. If any of these brought back a memory, or if you know of a forgotten park we didn't cover, drop it in the comments. If you found this video worth your time, please hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you'd think, and it keeps videos like this one coming.